This is not a strikeout, but it's also not a home run. We saw the U.S. agree to reduce tariffs on China by 10%. This will bring the average tariff rate from 57% down to 47%. That's not nothing, but it's not a sea change in U.S.-China relations. It's not going to change trade flows all that much. Perhaps more importantly, we saw both sides agree to pause some of their other economic sanctions and export controls for 1 year. This is the so-called 50% rule that was expanding U.S. blacklists of Chinese companies. We're going to pause that for a year. The Chinese are going to pause their export controls on these rare earth minerals for a year. And so I think, to use another analogy, both sides have lowered their weapons, but they haven't quite holstered them yet.
With me on Pino and Friends, Adam Bolton and Anna Mihailova, our political editor at Times Radio. Let's go stateside and talk about the latest there. The fears of a trade war, damaging trade war potentially between America and China, seems to have eased after that meeting at the Asia Summit between President Trump and President Xi of China. The US has now cut import taxes on Chinese goods. And I spoke earlier to Josh Birnbaum, who's the Deputy Director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy Center on Economic and Financial Power. He told me why he thought a trade deal was now mutually beneficial to both parties.
In many ways, things are going, I would view, according to plan. Both sides have shown their hand about what their most powerful weapon is. For the U.S., that's the threat of tariffs. Chinese economy is very much dependent on exports in order to grow, and the U.S. is the largest importer in the world. The tariffs really do hit China square in the most vulnerable part of their economy. For the U.S., the inability to manufacture and process rare earths and other critical minerals is exactly the leverage that China has. And so one would expect, especially for leaders of this type who are trying to see the soft spots in their opponent, that this is how it would play out.
Josh Birnbaum. Now, Kerry Brown is the Professor of Chinese Studies and the Director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. He told me China may have the upper hand after that meeting.
I think America wants to have, kind of have its cake and eat it, really. I mean, it's very dependent on these rare metals from China because it doesn't want to process them itself. That's a problem. They're not particularly rare. They're just really hard to process. I think for China, decoupling means less dependence on American technology, and they are progressing with that. There's some dependence on very high-end semiconductors, but many other areas China has made some progress. At the end of the day, it's a battle for markets. China is the largest trading partner for about 120 countries in the world now. America is not a significant manufacturer, but of course it's a significant investor and a financier. So it's two different areas of the economy they're battling in, and we will see what the political outcome of that is, but they're really looking for primacy in those areas of their strength.
Professor Kerry Brown there from King's College London. Now, we are joined now by Gavin Bade, always a good person to talk to at a time like this. He's the trade and economic policy reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Gavin, welcome back to the show.
John, great to be with you again.
Good to have you, Gavin. Look, what's your judgment on where we are just at the moment? See, earlier on, the markets didn't really react to what we heard from Air Force One. Maybe that's a good thing, because the markets are bouncing along pretty happily just at the moment, and it's a good sign. There was no great flurry. People didn't descend into despair. They thought, OK, things are going along. Could be much, much worse than this. Let's keep doing business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of my sources today said, if I may use an American analogy, this is not a strikeout, but it's also not a home run. We saw the U.S. agree to reduce tariffs on China by 10%. This will bring the average tariff rate from 57% down to 47%. That's not nothing, but it's not a sea change in U.S.-China relations. It's not going to change trade flows all that much. Perhaps more importantly, we saw both sides agree to pause some of their other economic sanctions and export controls for 1 year. This is the so-called 50% rule that was expanding U.S. blacklists of Chinese companies. We're going to pause that for a year. The Chinese are going to pause their export controls on these rare earth minerals for a year. And so I think, to use another analogy, both sides have lowered their weapons, but they haven't quite holstered them yet.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could say, can we, Gavin, that this is now seen as the new normal. The white knuckle ride is normal now. There were these, the Chinese getting ready to put up a sort of siege wall around rare earths, which are vital to technology all over the world. There were the Trump tariffs, which now seem to have gone down again. And there's a bit of a calm, even if it's a temporary calm. But on the way to this point, it's been anything but calm. equally, that's just how it is, and it seems as if markets and everyone else have got used to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we won't see a market tailspin like we saw this spring unless there's a huge flare up where you have triple digit tariffs like we had earlier this year when U.S. tariffs got up to 145%. I think neither side wants that. And that's why you saw, some cooler heads prevail this week in South Korea. I think the big question is, one, can this deal last? As you said, we've seen a lot of conversations throughout the year. The U.S. and China have met 3 times in Europe. Each time, one side or the other came outside the deal and did something that increased tensions again. So we haven't seen any text on this deal. We don't know any of the provisions, but we will have to see if this can last longer than a few months.
Okay.
Do we know if there's anything coming out of this meeting about the friendship without limits and, of course, the support for Russia in the Ukraine war from the talks?
I didn't hear anything coming out of the meeting about that. It seems like this was a pretty narrowly tailored meeting on these specific U.S.-China complaints. Also, the Taiwan issue does not appear to have been broached. So a lot of irritants still out there.
I mean, Gavin, the president did seem to say on Air Force One that he and President Xi spent a lot of time talking about Ukraine, but none of that seems to be spent talking about oil, which is telling in itself, isn't it? Because President Trump doesn't want to go there when it comes to China and oil. And China is such a massive buyer of Russian oil, even though India, for example, is getting punished for that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. has threatened, for instance, they've imposed tariffs on India for buying Russian oil, but they have not done the same thing for China. And I think that just shows you how delicate this relationship is. And I should say, yes, they talked about Ukraine, but this is what I'm trying to say is they didn't broach that issue of the oil purchases. He didn't threaten other tariffs because of the oil. So I think that issue seems to be on hold when it comes to U.S. and China.
Okay, so watch this space as was. I want to move on to something else. There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about, but the president seems to have finally recognized that he's not going to be able to run for a third term. He's not going to be able to go against the American Constitution in that way, which to the rest of the world looking in, that just seems normal. But it counts as a development, Gavin.
Absolutely. I mean, the president has been on both sides of this issue. We saw earlier this year he met with House Democrats and had Trump 2028 hats on his desk. Was that him just trolling the Democrats, or was it an indication of something he wants to do? And, he's said it many times, I'd love to do it. He thinks he has great poll numbers. I don't think we're at the end of the story yet, personally. There are a lot of Trump allies like Steve Bannon who would say there is a plan to have him run. I just don't think it'll involve him running for vice president. But watch this space. I don't think we're at the end of the storyline yet.
Yeah, it was notable, wasn't it, that Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, he was talking about this as something which wasn't going to happen. He clearly, and we know that he did have a word with President Trump about this, and maybe talk some, for want of a better word, talk some sense into him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people took heart in those comments from Speaker Johnson. But, let's remember that if Trump decides to do something, most of the Republican Party typically falls in line. So I could see him changing that position if Trump changes his.
All right. Gavin Bade at the Wall Street Journal. Great to have you with us, Gavin. Do come back again very, very soon.